In June 1894, a frontiersman named Ellis Bennett paid $400 for an entire building from the World's Fair. Not a souvenir, not a piece of one, the whole thing, an 18-room Southern colonial mansion built entirely of wood shipped up from Delaware, the official Delaware building of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It had cost $7,500 to construct. Bennett bought it for $400 because the alternative was the wrecking crew. Then he did something almost no one in history has ever done. He put a World's Fair building on rollers, dragged it onto 2 barges floating in Lake Michigan, sailed it down the lake shore and into the Calumet River, and hauled it 11 miles across the marsh to the edge of a shallow, duck-covered body of water called Wolf Lake. And there, on land he did not legally own, inside a piece of the vanished White City, Ellis Bennett and his family lived for the next 10 years. The official records tell you this is a story about squatters' rights. They tell you Bennett was a duck-hunting guide, a charming eccentric, a deadbeat who stiffed the men who moved his house and barricaded himself in a bedroom with several guns when the sheriff came. All of that is documented. The Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Inter-Ocean, and the Chicago Herald all covered him. On March 12, 1904, Cook County Deputy Sheriff John Long arrived at Wolf Lake with 25 men to evict him, and Bennett locked himself in a windowless bedroom and held out for 36 hours, firing twice through the door before Long finally broke through with an axe and found him snoring. But here's what those same records circle around without ever quite saying out loud. Almost every building of the 1893 World's Fair was deliberately destroyed. Hundreds of structures, an entire dream city of palaces, vanished from the earth within a single year, and the men who lived inside the few that survived, the Bennetts of history, seem to have built their lives on top of something the official story would rather we forget was ever there at all. This isn't folklore. This is newspaper archives, court records, eviction notices, and a federal archaeological survey conducted in 2017. This is about what the White City actually was, what happened to it, and why a Canadian frontiersman, with a habit of burning down his own houses, would risk a shootout with the law to keep living inside a fairground exhibit. Let's start with what the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition actually was, because the scale of it is almost impossible to believe today. It was built in Jackson Park on the south side of Chicago to mark 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. Designers covered its buildings in a material called staff, a mixture of plaster and plant fibers, painted brilliant white, and the effect was so overwhelming that visitors called it the White City. 27 million people walked through it in 6 months, at a time when the entire population of the United States was only about 65 million. And here is the first thing that should stop you. Almost none of it was real. The palaces, the colonnades, the domes that visitors described as marble, they were plaster over wood and steel frames. They were stage sets. The White City was built to be photographed, walked through, and then erased. The fair closed in October 1893. And over the following months, the buildings came down. Most of them burned. In 1894, a series of fires destroyed the remaining structures, and only the useful steel frames were pulled out of the ash and carried away to be melted and reused. Think about that sequence. A city of plaster palaces, the most beautiful thing 27 million people had ever seen, and within a year of the gates closing, it had been reduced to fragments and steel scrap. When archaeologists from the Illinois State Archaeological Survey dug 7 sites in Jackson Park in late 2017, ahead of the proposed Obama Presidential Center, they found 9,841 artifacts. But of the White City itself, they found no building foundations, no statuary, no intact columns. What they pulled out of the ground were shards, red fragments thought to be from Louis Sullivan's transportation building, amber stained glass, pieces of that plaster and fiber staff, broken cups stamped with the seal of the official coffee supplier, buttons, spoons, nails, and animal bones near where the fair's trash incinerator once stood. A city that millions had walked through, and 124 years later, all that remained in the soil was coffee cup shards and the bones of food waste. The White City didn't just close, it was unmade, which is exactly why Ellis Bennett's house matters, because the Delaware building should have gone the way of all the others. The plan had been to take it apart and rebuild it back in Delaware, but the economic depression that followed the fair killed that idea, and the building was left facing demolition. Bennett, a man the Inter-Ocean joked had so much trouble with house fires that locals said he was running a lighthouse. A man who had already lost his fourth house to flames saw the building and bought it for $400 in June 1894, just as the fires were taking the rest of the fair. Now sit with the strangeness of who this man was. Bennett was Canadian-born, arrived in the Calumet Marshes in 1869 in a place the Chicago Tribune described as a solitary waste, where human life is only possible by the blessing of copious horns of whiskey." End quote. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of man you would not want as a neighbor. And this is the man who decided that a doomed 18-room mansion from the White City was worth floating 11 miles across open water to save. He had it rolled onto barges, sailed down the lakeshore, dragged through the Calumet River, and finally hauled onto dry ground at Wolf Lake. And then the trouble began, because Bennett didn't own the land. The Knickerbocker Ice Company held a competing claim to it. And here is where the story opens onto something much larger than one squatter. Because to understand why that land was worth fighting over, you have to understand what was being harvested out of Wolf Lake. This was the age before refrigeration. By 1890, Chicago was consuming an estimated 2 million tons of ice every year. The entire meat empire of the city, the stockyards, the rail cars carrying beef across the country, depended on slabs of ice sawn from frozen lakes to keep the meat from rotting. The Chicago Herald recorded that buyers from New Orleans, the West Indies, Mexico, and South America were all purchasing ice cut here. Knickerbocker claimed to own the largest ice houses in the world, where hundreds of seasonal workers sawed foot-thick slabs around the clock through the winter. The company swore its ice was pristine, but chemists from the reform-minded Civic Federation tested it and found it was about as pure as you'd expect from a weedy lake full of ducks. This was the water being shipped into the kitchens, saloons, and butcher shops of half a hemisphere. So Bennett wasn't just a squatter on an empty marsh. He was a man living inside a salvaged piece of the White City, planted directly in the path of one of the great hidden industries of the 19th century, the harvesting of frozen lake water to feed a continent that had no other way to keep its food from spoiling. In 1895, he sued Knickerbocker, claiming the company's men had roughed him up, stolen his pillows and blankets, and framed him. He lost. He also owed John Jarman, the house mover who had floated the Delaware building to Wolf Lake in the first place and was never paid, and who now claimed the house itself through an unpaid note. I want to be honest about something here, because the deeper I went into the records, the stranger the pattern became. I went into this expecting a simple frontier eviction story. A squatter, a sheriff, a shootout. That story is fully documented, and it is dramatic enough on its own. But the part that the newspapers report and then walk straight past is what happened after the siege. Bennett held out for 36 hours, fired through the door, was dragged to the Cook County Jail, and told the Inter-Ocean a week later, "The whole thing was gigantic bluff, and I didn't try to hit nobody." He faced eviction by the ice company and a competing claim from the man who moved his house. By every law and every logic, he should have lost the Delaware building forever. And then, the records simply stop explaining. The Chicago Magazine account, drawn from the court files, states it plainly. Mysteriously, Bennett was able to move back to Delaware House. Court records give no guidance as to how Bennett came to a settlement with either Knickerbocker or Jarman. That is a real gap in the historical record. A man with no legal title, no money, a criminal eviction on his record, and two separate powerful claimants, and somehow he walks back into the World's Fair mansion and stays. The documents that should explain how do not exist. And once you've watched an entire city of plaster palaces get erased down to coffee cup shards in a single year, you start to wonder how often the records around the White City just happen to stop right at the moment they tell you something. Here is the speculative layer, the question the documents won't answer for us. Why was this one building worth all of it? The barges, the lawsuit, the 36-hour gun siege, the vanished settlement. The official answer is that Bennett was a stubborn eccentric who liked the house. Maybe. But consider what the Delaware building physically was. It was one of the last surviving fragments of a city that powerful interests had spent a year systematically destroying. Everyone else let their piece of the White City burn. Bennett floated his 11 miles across a lake and defended it with a rifle. What did he understand about that building that the men who burned the rest of the fair did not? Or, the darker version, what did the people who erased the White City understand that made a man like Bennett a known arsonist, a land grabber, a survivor of the marsh, decide that this one structure was the single thing in his violent life worth keeping standing? We don't get to know. Because the ending is the same ending every White City story has. Bennett didn't even die there. In 1915, one of his own sons shot him in the groin after Bennett ordered the young man to move out. In 1922, he went back to Canada to marry for the fourth time, and he died in Seattle in 1931. The house outlived him as a ruin. In 1943, the Chicago Tribune described the Delaware building crumbling among the trees Bennett planted around it to prove it's mine. And in the 1950s, according to the Southeast Chicago Historical Society, the last great surviving fragment of the 1893 World's Fair finally came down. No monument marks it. Bennett's contemporary, the squatter George Streeter, got an entire Chicago neighborhood named after him, Streeterville. Bennett got nothing. His kingdom was swallowed by industry, a quiet neighborhood, and parkland. So the question isn't really whether the last family who lived inside a World's Fair building found something behind their walls. The building is gone. The man is gone. The settlement that let him keep the house is a hole in the court record that no one can explain. The whole White City is gone, burned, scrapped, dug back out of the ground a century later as nothing but broken cups and the bones of someone's lunch. The question is the one the archives keep almost answering and then dropping. 27 million people walked through a city of white palaces, and within a year, someone made sure almost none of it survived. One ornery frontiersman dragged a single piece of it across a lake and held it at gunpoint until the day he died. And when the records reach the moment that would tell us why he was allowed to keep it, they simply go quiet. The same way they always seem to go quiet around the White City. The ducks still come back to Wolf Lake. The Tribune called them the most stubborn holdouts of all, but the building they nested beside, the last standing fragment of the most photographed city that never really existed, is gone, and almost no one alive remembers that a man once loved it enough to float it across a lake, or asks what was really worth burning a whole White City to the ground to erase.